Hi everyone, welcome to Yoga with Heini. I'm Heini and today we're going to look at Warrior III pose in detail. We're going to look at how to practice the pose, different variations, how to use props, how to breathe in the pose, and finally injury prevention, how to keep our bodies safe in the pose. Let's get started. Let's first look at the basic form of Warrior III. So it's a one-legged standing balancing pose. It's a great pose for strengthening the feet, the legs, all support around the hips, your core, your back, and it improves your balance. It's one of my favorite balancing poses, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. I have quite hypermobile hips, so I've really had my challenges practicing this pose. Yes, so basic form, we're going to come stand on one foot. And we are first looking for a long line from hip to the back leg foot. So that's going to be our lifted leg. So think about lengthening the line from hip to that foot. The spine could be in neutral or what we call in axial extension. So in axial extension, we are actively trying to kind of lengthen the line, lengthen the space between head and the tail, reaching the spine longer. And for a moment, reducing the curves of the spine. And from that one-legged shape, we start to then lengthen the upper body down and forward. So we're tilting the upper body forward. And now the back leg, my left leg, is going to come up. So we're trying to keep that long line from head to the foot going on. And we start to actively reach that lifted leg back. So head reaching forward and that lifted leg reaching back. So it's an active line from head to that foot. Now hips, you can see lots of different kind of options for hip alignment there. There's no one right or wrong way. You could aim to keep your hips in the same level. So rather than letting the hips open, you try to keep the hips kind of parallel. And this option is often a bit more challenging for the hips because you're asking the muscles here on the outside of the hip to stretch and engage at the same time, which is kind of the most challenging action a muscle can do. So I like to practice like this. I like to practice with that option with my hips rather closed because it really strengthens the support around the hips. There is an option also to open the pelvis a bit more. That could be an option, but just kind of be mindful and aware of what you're doing. So that you can make an active choice in your pose, in your body, and be aware of, okay, are my hips open or are my hips aligned in the same level? And maybe alter between those options. So not always practicing the same way, but sometimes changing a bit the way you practice the pose. But being aware that there are those options for the hips. Just in general, in all balancing poses, I would suggest to focus your gaze onto something. So when you are in the pose, find a point where you can focus your eyes on. It often helps with all balancing poses. And when we are in Warrior III, my suggestion is to find that spot somewhere down rather than right in front of you so that you could keep your neck in line with your back. Rather than tilting the neck, tilting the head and creating too much tension in the neck. Think about reaching the head, the crown of the head away from the foot and keeping your neck in line with the back. Then, let's talk about different options for the arms. There's no one right or wrong way to have your arms. I'll show you 4 different options and you can play with these different options in your practice. So basic option would be to bring hands together, palms together in front of the chest, maybe even lightly press the hands against each other. And what this might do is create a bit more activation in the upper body, around the upper back and also in the core. So that could be one way to have your arms. Another way could be to have your arms down next to your sides and that might help with the balance. So you have a bit more kind of wider reach for your arms. So that might help with the balance. You could even open them into a T shape. That's a very good option as well. You could bring arms over the head. So once you are in that balancing pose, you could lengthen arms over the head, kind of towards the top of the mat. Now just be aware that this is probably the most challenging for your back, for your core, because you're bringing extra weight over the head. So if you feel that this is too strong for the back, then bring arms down. And then the fourth option is to bring hands together behind the pelvis, interlock fingers, and then extend the arms. And now you might see me wobbling here already. This is quite challenging for the core, but it might help you to open the chest a bit more, kind of reminder to keep the chest open rather than hunching the back down and forward. Oops, I need to come up. So those four options for the arms. Of course, there could be more options, but those are kind of the four basic ones that I tend to teach. But you can play with different options in your practice. And then different ways to come into the pose. So I already showed you the basic way. So standing on one foot, kind of starting from standing up and then tilting forward. And yeah, so that could be one way to go into the pose. But another way could be to come from down and then lift yourself up. So rather than starting from standing and tilting forward and down, start from the mat. Maybe from downward dog, for example, and then step your foot under your chest or under the belly. And now we're quite low down here. You can maybe see my back is quite rounded. I still have that back foot down on the mat. So what I need to do here is really start to focus on engaging the back line, engaging the back to lift my chest away from the mat, and also engage the back line through that lifted leg, through that left leg, so that I could lift from mat into that kind of about horizontal line. And what it does is you're asking your body to do different kind of muscular actions. You're asking a bit different muscles to activate and work to bring you into the pose. And I think it's really, really healthy to change sometimes the way you go into a pose, because you can find new aspects in the pose and your body that you maybe didn't find earlier. So I suggest playing with different ways of going into the pose. And just quickly, before we look at the props, should we always be in a fully horizontal line? Is that the only way to do the pose? No, definitely not. So I suggest just thinking about the long line from head to foot. And if you start, for example, from standing here, maybe this is your warrior 3. So we don't need to go into fully horizontal line all the way down, but pause and stop and find your balance in a place on an edge where you feel that you can balance. Yeah, rather than pushing yourself too far and then falling over, just start from a place where you feel you can focus on the balance, you can focus on breathing in the pose, and then slowly, we can maybe work our way into that horizontal line. Possibly, depending on how you feel in the pose. But don't go too far too soon. I'll show you how to use 2 different props for Warrior 3. And the first one here is chair. This could be a wall as well. We're going to bring hands onto the back of the chair or hands onto a wall. And make sure you have enough room between your chest, your head and the wall or the chair. And then we're going to use this as a support for our balance. So keeping hands on that support, it's a bit more easy to find the balance. You can walk the hands further down. Of course, I have a chair that's now twisting and turning. So maybe if you have a chair that doesn't turn, doesn't have wheels, that's a bit more stable. But this could be a great way to start practicing the pose, for example, or if there's any risk of fall, then use a support that you can lean on. And you can then always, when you are in the pose, you can maybe take one arm off or even both arms, hands off that support. But you have it there, so you can lean on it if you want. So that's one prop. And another one, especially if we come from down up, could be a block. So now I'm going to put a block here at the top of the mat, and I'm starting from downward facing dog, and I'm going to step my foot forward, and then when I start to lift up, I'm now going to use this block under the hands. Whoops. So I'm going to use this block under the hands to help me lift the back up. So again, I have something to lean on. Of course, the block could be also a bit taller. And same like with a chair or the wall, you could take one hand up, you could take the other hand up, but you always have it there so that if you want to lean on the support, you have it there. So a block can be a really useful prop as well. I'll just start with, there's no right or wrong way to breathe in or out from the pose. What can be really, really useful is to use, before you start to find your balance, use your exhalation to ground down. Find that kind of rooting in the standing leg foot before you start to go anywhere else. So really exhale, grounding down. I tend to use exhalation to also go into the pose. If I come from standing up, I like to exhale, kind of fly forward. But the exhalation idea of moving down into the pose, it also helps me stay a bit more grounded in that standing leg foot. But lately I've been playing with the idea of inhaling into the pose, and what that has done is it has brought a bit more lightness into the pose. So I've started with exhaling, again rooting, grounding down, but then using the inhalation to really kind of fly forward. And to me personally, it makes the pose feel lighter. The exhalation is more kind of grounding and going down, but the inhalation has really helped to find a bit more that flying idea and floating into the pose. No right or wrong there. Same as when you come out from the pose. So you could use the idea of exhaling. So when you lift up, you exhale, really pressing down through that standing leg foot. And coming up with the idea of almost pushing yourself up. Or again, the idea of inhalation lifting you up. So no right or wrong, but again, I suggest you to play with the breath, and sometimes every now and then change the way you breathe, going in, coming out from the pose. While we are in the pose, we'd like to keep the belly lifted in slightly, so we're not kind of collapsing in the core. And for that, we need to find a bit more breath going to the rib cage. So when we are in the pose, think that you're lifting, gently drawing in through the lower belly, even through the pelvic floor, and you're breathing here to your rib cage, allowing the rib cage to more kind of expand, open out to the side, what we call the lateral breathing. Yeah, so breathing more sideways to the front, to the back of the rib cage, and keeping that gentle, subtle lift in the deeper core, in the lower belly. It might even help you to, with each exhalation, kind of lift in and up a bit more. So the exhalation rising up from your lower belly. Warrior 3 is, in a way, quite safe pose because there's so much you can modify and so much you can change in the edge. So how far into the pose you go, you can control all that yourself in the pose. So in that sense, the pose is quite safe. But we need to think about few injuries. So if you know you have some existing injuries already, for example, in the back. So When we go into this kind of balancing pose, where as we go down with the upper body, the gravity starts to pull your belly, your chest, everything down towards the ground. So then if there are injuries in the back and we're not enough supported in the core and we're not enough lifting in and supporting on the front side, we might start to feel pain, aches in the back. So then if you know that there is already an injury in the back, we might be aggravating it. So really focusing on supporting on the front side so we're not loading the back too much. And like I showed with those arm variations, if you bring your arms over the head, it is loading the back more. So if you know there are any issues in the back, you want to keep the pose a bit more gentle for the back, then keep the arms down. Don't bring them over the head. So again, it's easier for the back to cope in the pose. Because it's a balancing pose, there is always risk of fall. So if you know that you have injuries or some conditions that are extra sensitive for falling, then I would suggest to use some props like the chair, like a wall, to have with you so you can support yourself onto that prop. So you can feel that you're safe, you're not gonna fall down. So just be aware of that, and you can always use props like a wall, like the chair, to support you in the pose. Because in the pose, we are tilting forward from the pelvis. If you have injuries in the hamstrings, in that standing leg, you might start to aggravate hamstring injuries as well. Because you are, as you tilt your pelvis forward, you are lengthening, you are stretching that hamstring on the backside. You are also engaging it, so it's also activating, but you're also creating a stretch there. So if you know that you have a hamstring injury, and when you do the pose, you start to feel some niggles, pain in the hamstring, don't go so far down, yeah? So remember, like I said, you don't have to go into horizontal line. Even here, I'm just tilting forward quite little, lifting the leg a little bit off the mat. I'm still practicing my balance, and I'm training that long line from head to the foot. And I don't need to go all the way into the horizontal plane to practice those things. So if you have injuries in the hamstrings, you can be mindful and modify how far down you tilt from the pelvis. And then knee injuries. If you start to feel the pose or any one-legged balancing pose hurting in the knees, I would suggest to slightly bend the knee. Because it might be that you're locking the knee and you're leaning too much onto the joint and not activating the muscles around the joint that should be there supporting. So then I would suggest bend the knee slightly and really start to focus on engaging around the knee, so in the thigh and the calf, on both sides of the thigh, so that you're not just leaning into the joint. And especially if you have kind of hyperextending knees, like I have slightly, I tend to sometimes get quite a lot of pain in the knee if I'm just locking the knee hanging on the joint, and that's not going to be good for the joint. So then bending the knee a bit, it really forces me to engage the muscles, and I start to activate that support for the joint. And a bit same in the hips. Like I said there in the beginning, I have quite hypermobile hips, so I've really had to work my way with this pose. So then, rather than just, again, kind of leaning into the pose and leaning into the joint and allowing the pelvis to open a bit, because then it's easier to go down, I have really started to make myself keep the hips in the same level, and that forces the muscles around the hips to again work more. So trying to build support rather than thinking about, I want to go really far into the pose. Let's see how far I can stretch myself into the pose. If you already know you have a lot of mobility around the hips, then start to find a bit more conservative way of going into the pose and really making yourself keep the hips close. So keep your hips parallel. You can even have your hands in the hips so you can feel they're not opening up. And then just see how far you could go with that. And it might be, again, you're not going all the way to horizontal, that's perfectly fine. And if you start to feel wobbly, that's perfectly fine as well. But just trying to build that support, that strength around the hips if they are already really mobile. And for hypermobile hips, also practicing moving can be really, really useful. So rather than only practicing fixing yourself into the pose and then staying there, practice moving. So going into the pose and lifting up and bringing that lifted knee in front and repeating that movement. Again, that really starts to build up support around the hips, strengthening the muscles, all that support around the hips. You know, few repetitions, going down and coming up. It can be really useful. Again, it might be quite difficult in the beginning. All those muscles will strengthen up and it will all become easier with time. Yeah, I think that's my list of cautions today. As usual, if you know that you have an injury, if you have a medical condition that might be aggravated by practicing this pose or any other pose, always check with your medical professional first, with your physio, your doctor, if it is safe for you to practice the pose. So don't put yourself at risk for the practice. We can always modify poses. We can also find different poses to practice the same things. So keep yourself safe. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. If you did, click subscribe and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of any new videos. I'll be posting lots more yoga related videos on this channel. I also teach online yoga classes, and if you're interested in those, you'll find more information in the description box below and on my website. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.